We light our chalice, symbol of faith, perseverance, and hope, in astonished thanksgiving and irrepressible praise. For beginnings that emerge out of endings, appear amidst continuity, become visible in hindsight, we light our chalice, symbol of faith, perseverance, and hope, in astonished thanksgiving and irrepressible praise. For this time and all the times and all the ways we have begun anew, we light our chalice, symbol of faith, perseverance, and hope, in astonished thanksgiving and irrepressible praise. So again, we are glad you're here tonight for what will surely be a most informative session, COVID Vaccine 101 and life in a post-COVID vaccine world. We are delighted to have as our speaker, Dr. Karen Remley. Dr. Remley is the director for CDC's National Center on Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities. She has more than 30 years of experience in public health and healthcare, with leadership roles in the public and private sectors. Her North Star has always been children and families, and she has shaped her career around helping every family have the best opportunity for health and well-being. Prior to joining this center, Dr. Remley served as senior advisor to the COVID-19 response to the Office of the Commissioner, Virginia Department of Health, where she was instrumental in increasing and assuring tested for COVID-19 to ensure it was widely available across the Commonwealth of Virginia. She also worked as a professor of pediatrics at Eastern Virginia Medical School, and Dr. Remley has served on many national committees and commissions working on public health education, health equity, and patient safety, including her roles as Chief Executive Officer of the American Academy of Pediatrics, as Commissioner of Health for the Commonwealth of Virginia under 2 governors, as Chief Medical Director of Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield Virginia, and Chief Executive Officer of Physicians for Peace. In 2018, she served as the inaugural Senior Fellow at the de Beaumont Foundation, a foundation dedicated to pragmatic solutions to improve public health. Dr. Remley earned an MBA from the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University, an MPH at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and her MD from the University of Missouri in Kansas City. She completed her pediatrics residency at St. Louis Children's Hospital, Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. So one housekeeping note before I turn this over to Dr. Remley. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the session. And I think because there are so many of us here tonight, the easiest way to handle this is if you will put your questions in chat, and you're welcome to put them in there as we go along. I will collect them, and then I can ask them of Dr. Remley at the end of the session. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Dr. Remley.
Thank you. First of all, everybody, please call me Karen. And
Okay.
Thank you for that introduction. I think the only thing that's missing is I am, I care about, I've got 2 in-laws who are 88 and 91. So I'm worried about them getting vaccinated. Most of my family's in the healthcare field. And I am very proud to say I have an 18-month-old, most beautiful, most wonderful grandson in the world. So as we talk about COVID and the COVID vaccines tonight, know that everybody in my family, except for the 18-month-old, has gotten their first shot. And then I encouraged everyone I knew to get it as quickly as possible. And I can't think of any better way to talk about the development and the safety of vaccines than to say that you choose them for the people you love. In our family, we talk about vaccines as surrounding people with a cocoon of love, because we know that our grandson can't get vaccinated yet. So we want him to be surrounded and be safe. And that's what vaccines really do for our communities. So I want to thank especially Godfrey for inviting me, but I really want to thank all of you for this opportunity. We're going to talk about different types of COVID vaccines that have been approved for emergency use. We're going to talk about the safety systems that exist, which I think is even more important now as we have the pause with J&J. And then we're going to talk about what do we know right now about what can you do once you are fully vaccinated as an individual, as families, and as communities. So next slide. So we'll go to the next slide. There we go. And we'll talk, oops. Are we flipping to the next one, or did I say next too many times? If we can go to the next one, that'd be great. There we go. There we go. So this actually, oh gosh, I think you got the older slide. I have a different slide deck than you guys have. So what I will tell you is this is from March 9th, but now as of April 19th, so yesterday, 209,406,814 vaccines have been given in our country. So it's pretty impressive if you look at the difference between March 9th and April 20th, that we've been given them 100 million doses. If you were looking at the slide I was looking at, you'd see there's also been about 8 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine given too. And so since we've had multiple vaccines developed and they've all been put through clinical trials. So far, the three we've talked about, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer, have received the FDA emergency use authorization. We continue to work with states to understand what roadblocks are. And if you were going to look at this slide from yesterday, and you can see it on our CDC COVID data tracker, you would see that we still have issues with Mississippi and Alabama having very low vaccination rates compared to the rest of the country. The most of the country now is turning blue. So let's go to the next slide. We're going to first talk about vaccines, so we can go to the third slide. So these are the currently authorized vaccines. We know that there are three. The Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is authorized for persons age 18 years and older. It is, 16 years and older, and it is an mRNA vaccine that's given in 2 doses at least 21 days apart. And we'll talk a little bit more about what an mRNA vaccine is. The Moderna vaccine is authorized for persons aged 18 years and older. It is mRNA vaccine given in 2 doses, at least 28 days apart. And then the Johnson & Johnson or the Janssen vaccine is authorized for people 18 years and older, and it is a single dose viral vector vaccine, and we'll go over that. These have all been tested in tens and thousands of adults, including minorities and older adults. All of the available vaccines have been proven effective in preventing serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And that's important because I'm sure some of you have heard in the news about the very rare situation where there are breakthrough infections. Those breakthrough infections are not serious illness and death. We don't currently know how long the protection from receiving a vaccine might last. So there are studies going on across the country with people that have been vaccinated where we're routinely testing them to identify any kind of infection that may occur, especially those that may be asymptomatic. Next slide. So as we look at these different vaccines, we talked about the Pfizer-Moderna vaccine, we talked about the Janssen vaccine, but we also have AstraZeneca, which is similar to the, is very similar to the Janssen vaccine, is it uses a chimp adenovirus vector. It is in phase 3 trials here in our country, but it has not yet been approved for use in our country, but it has been approved for use in Europe. The advantage is if you look at the vaccines on the right side of the screen, they require not significant cold chain storage, so not special refrigerated vaccine, deep freeze as you need for Pfizer and for Moderna. Novavax is another vaccine which is different in that it's a nanoparticle vaccine that adds an adjuvant. It has not yet come forward for emergency use authorization with the FDA. Next slide, please. So we do know that all vaccines are currently safe and effective. And we know that millions of people, as we said, over 200 million have received the vaccine. They are all being evaluated. They were carefully evaluated in clinical trials that continue. Right now, there are clinical trials going on with adolescents and also a trial that started with children 6 months to 12 years of age. And we do know how important it is to get vaccinated. Next slide, please. So what do? We fast track the vaccines while ensuring safety. And I think what's really important to know here is that the vaccines were, the technology for a vaccine is new, but it's not unknown, the mRNA technology. It's been studied for decades in vaccine trials for influenza Zika, and rabies. Beyond vaccines, cancer research has also used messenger RNA to trigger the immune system to target specific cancer cells. Scientists began creating viral vectors. So that's the mRNA that we've been using, and that's in the Pfizer and in the Moderna. Scientists started using viral vectors in the 1970s. So viral vectors, which are AstraZeneca and Janssen, have been used to study gene therapy, to treat cancer, and for molecular biology research. For decades, hundreds of scientific studies of viral vector vaccines have been done and published around the world. Some vaccines that recently were used for Ebola outbreaks that have used viral vector technology, and a number of studies have focused on viral vector vaccines against other infectious diseases such as Zika, flu, and HIV. And the other important thing when we talk about fast tracking that we need to remember is one of the things that happened with last year was they started developing the manufacturing capacity to make the vaccines before the vaccines were even developed, knowing that we wanted to have this done as quickly as possible. So where people talk about this being faster than normal, one of the reasons it's faster than normal is rather than waiting to develop the capacity to make the vaccine after the vaccine was approved, the government invested in making sure that all of the factories were ready to be able to push out vaccine as soon as they were approved. And then the other thing to know is the mRNA vaccines are faster and cheaper to produce because they use ready-made materials. Next slide, please. So how do we look at safety for vaccines? And so obviously we want to hold the COVID-19 vaccine to the exact same safety standards of all the various vaccines that our children get, our grandchildren get, and that we get. So before authorization, the CDC, before anything can be administered, the FDA reviews all of the safety data that the company brings forward, who has produced that vaccine. Then after they've reviewed that and they have approved it, it then goes to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And you've heard about ACIP, I'm sure, on the news. It is an independent body of experts who are tasked to review all safety data before they recommend use. Then the FDA and ACIP all have qualified scientific and clinical experts who have to have minimal conflicts of interest. Then the ACIP committee makes a recommendation to the director of the CDC. Then the director of the CDC makes a recommendation to all of the states. Ultimately, the states are where vaccine is administered. So then what happens afterwards? So these vaccines have been out now since late December. After the vaccine comes out, we have systems in place that rapidly detect any possible vaccine safety problems. These are not new systems. These systems were scaled up because there were so many vaccines occurring around our country, but they have been in place. The B-Safe is actually a new technology in that now you can use, and any of you who've been vaccinated may have enrolled in B-Safe. It's a smartphone-based after vaccination health checker for people who receive COVID vaccines. And then VAERS is really the gold standard. That's the vaccine adverse event reporting system that both the CDC and the FDA monitor. And that collects reports from healthcare professionals, vaccine manufacturers, and the public. So anyone who thinks they may have had an adverse event, or a physician who thinks they may be seeing somebody who had an adverse event, can fill out the VAERS form. The information gets conveyed to the FDA and the CDC, and they investigate those and look for safety signals. Next slide, please. So we talked about B-Safe, and what's exciting about B-Safe is that, especially young people, healthcare providers were all using it. It uses text messaging and web surveys to provide personalized health check-ins after you receive a COVID vaccine. So you can quickly tell, it will ask you if you're having any side effects and you can answer back. And if you say you are, somebody from the CDC may call and get more information. It will also remind you when to get your second vaccine if you need one. So we've encouraged everybody who receives a vaccine to participate in VSAT. And it's a wonderful opportunity to have that interaction back and forth, especially with people that like text messages and being able to kind of self-identify problems. Next slide. So what to expect before and after and during COVID vaccination. Certainly knowing what you're going to have happen is you want to be able to learn about the vaccine, be able to know what vaccine will be available to you as you go forward. and to be able to make sure you know which vaccine is recommended for you during reading the fact sheet, which tells you about the specific vaccine, making sure you get that vaccination record card. I encourage everybody to take, if you haven't done it yet, take a picture of your record card, with your cell phone and save that, and maybe even send it to a loved one, like a husband, wife, or so if something ever happened to your phone or to your card, you have it somewhere else where somebody has a copy of that. And then we expect people, especially after their second dose, to have some side effects, mild headaches, maybe chills, low-grade fevers, and just kind of a sense of general fatigue can happen in the first 24 hours. Enrolling in Be Safe helps you ask and answer those questions, and then really making sure that even though you've gotten vaccinated, you continue to use the measures that we recommend to protect yourself and others. Next slide. So what are key facts about after vaccination? So I want to address some of those. Getting vaccinated can help you prevent getting sick with COVID-19. How the vaccine works is it teaches your immune system how to recognize and fight the virus that causes COVID-19. And this protects you from getting sick with COVID-19. People who've gotten sick with COVID-19 may still benefit from getting vaccinated. So people who say to you, oh, I had COVID last year, I don't need a vaccine, really it's a good idea for them to get vaccinated. Because of the severe health risks associated with COVID-19 and the fact that reinfection is possible, and we have seen it, vaccines should be offered to you regardless of whether you already have had COVID-19 infection. At this time, we also don't know how long someone is protected from getting sick again after they've recovered from COVID-19, so another reason to get the vaccine. Thirdly, you can't get COVID-19 from vaccine. None of the vaccines that are recommended and authorized in the United States contain any live virus that causes COVID-19. This means that you can't get sick from the shot itself with COVID-19. And then lastly, COVID-19 vaccines will not cause you to test positive on viral tests. Neither the recently authorized and recommended vaccines nor the other COVID-19 vaccines currently in clinical trials in the United States can cause you to test positive on viral tests, which are used to see if you have a current infection. If your body develops an immune response, which is what we want the vaccine to do, there is a possibility you may test positive in some of the antibody tests, and that's a good thing because we want to be able to have antibodies. An antibody test indicate if you had a previous infection and that you may have some level of protection against the virus. Experts are currently looking at how, when we've been vaccinated, that may impact those antibody testing results, and we're learning more every week. Next slide. So you've heard a lot about variants and vaccine effectiveness. So far, studies suggest that antibodies generated through vaccination with the vaccines that are authorized currently in the United States are recognizing those variants. So they are protecting us. But we continue to closely investigate, and there are more studies underway looking at that. There is some preliminary data in Europe and South Africa that demonstrates that the AstraZeneca vaccine may not be as effective against the B.1.351 variant, but that it is still very effective in preventing significant disease. But again, we continue to monitor that. Next slide. So vaccination is one measure to help stop the pandemic. So while we want to make sure everybody understands it's one tool. So COVID vaccines appear to be highly effective. Additional preventive tools remain important. As you know, you've heard that vaccines are anywhere between 90 to 95% effective. That means 5 to 10% of people may get a mild case. If you get a very mild case and you don't wear a mask and you don't socially distance, you could potentially spread it to someone who's not vaccinated. And that's why it's so important right now, while we have a significant amount of virus still circulating in our communities, that we continue to wash our hands, avoid close contact, cover your nose and mouth with a mask, and really making sure that we do that for each other, not just for ourselves. It's going to take a while, as you know, to get everybody in the United States vaccinated who wants to be. And meanwhile, these are very important measures for us. Next slide. So this is our response to health equity. And I think it's really important to share with you. I think if any of us knew that our health system might not be equitable, The COVID vaccine has truly laid that, the COVID pandemic has truly laid that bare as we see increased numbers of cases and deaths in people of color and people who are in poverty. We want to make sure that as we respond, that we do these 4 things: expand the evidence base. So we really are looking at the evidence and trying to understand the drivers and that we can have a significant impact; to expand programs and practice activities to reach populations that have been put at increased risk; and to expand the program and practice activities to support essential and frontline workers. So that's one of the reasons you heard when vaccine first came out, after healthcare workers, those frontline workers who are in our grocery stores helping us get food, the really basic things we need every day to get vaccinated. And then lastly, to expand an inclusive workforce equipped to assess and address the needs of an increasingly diverse US population. So making sure as we look towards health equity, we're looking at ways to bring everybody to the table and have that conversation be as open, honest, and diverse as it can be. Next slide. So there's a national effort to build confidence in COVID-19 vaccination among communities of color. And this is the spring of 2021, and we are funding hundreds of organizations. We are establishing partnerships with everything from the National Urban League, the NAACP, and the National Medical Association. Those monies are out and that work is being done. The partnerships with pharmacies has expanded significantly, and there will be 21 pharmacies that will be involved in the federal program across the country. In addition, we work with federally qualified health centers, which are funded through the federal government to provide primary care in multiple sites, frequently in places where there are working poor and who may be covered by Medicaid or Medicare, to make sure that they have access to vaccine. Next slide. And I don't know what happened. And Wendy, I'm going to ask you, because all of my mRNA slides that I have in my presentation were not in this one. So maybe you can find those for me as I finish out this.
I will send them. I'll send them to Hildegarde.
Thank you. Because I know people are interested about the science around the mRNA, and somehow it didn't make it to the ones you all had. Maternal vaccination safety summary. This is important because any of you who know much about the NIH, pregnant women and children have been excluded from the majority of research that's been done in our country, mainly because for a long time they were considered vulnerable populations, but they were also more expensive to study because you have more safety requirements for children and pregnant women. So when the vaccines were studied before they were authorized, there were no pregnant women intentionally included. There were a few women who were pregnant but did not know they were when they received the vaccine. So the only way we really have is to be able to monitor people who are pregnant when they receive the vaccine. And I'm proud to say this slide is outdated. There are 70,000 self-reported pregnant people now registered in BSafe. So those are women who self-identified themselves as pregnant when they signed up to that text messaging. And we reach back out to them and we get information from them to understand how their pregnancy is going and then how the baby and the mom are doing post-pregnancy. So the reactogenicity profile and adverse events observed, it has not to date indicated any safety problems. And most of the reports to bears among pregnant women involved non-pregnancy specific adverse events, like a swollen arm, or what I talked about, the kind of feeling of malaise or a low-grade headache. The most frequent miscarriage was the most frequently reported pregnancy adverse event, but the numbers are well within the known background rates, which happen with people who are not getting COVID vaccine. Next slide. So safety of vaccines for people with disabilities. Because I'm at the Center on Birth Defects and Disabilities, I get this question asked a lot. These studies that were done pre-vaccine approval did not, in particular, include people with disabilities, but they also did not exclude them. And as we know, anywhere from 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people in our country have some type of disability. So there were people with disabilities included in this study. We've had no evidence that there's any kind of different profile, and the vaccine, as we said, was held to the same standard. Next slide. So I know many of you are grandparents, so wanted to walk through where we are with that. So let's start at the top. The biotech, the Pfizer vaccine as we talked about, that's the mRNA vaccine, and it has a little piece of RNA that goes into your cell. It makes your cell then develop antibodies to the spike protein. It's the same way the Moderna vaccine works. We talked about the doses they're different amounts and they're farther apart, and that is just a function of being two different vaccines by two companies. Obviously, Pfizer is 16 and up. So right now, children and young adults who are 16 and 17 can get Pfizer. Anybody over 18 can get Pfizer or Moderna. We know that adolescents are fully enrolled in both the Moderna and the Pfizer study right now in ongoing clinical evaluations. Younger children have started to be enrolled in the Pfizer program, as have they in the Moderna program. So then we'll go over to Janssen and Janssen. That's where we are using that adenovirus for that and for AstraZeneca. Those doses are AstraZeneca is one dose, and Janssen AstraZeneca is two doses. Janssen, they tested two doses, but they decided to go with one. This slide is outdated. They finished, as you know, and that was approved. And adolescents were started in trials. That's been paused right now, along with all of the other use of Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So to summarize this, right now, Pfizer and Moderna, who are the mRNA vaccines, are doing research and clinical trials with children between the ages of 12 and 16 or 12 and 18. And they have just recently, in the last 3 weeks, started studies from 6 months up to 12. So depending upon how long it takes to enroll and then how long they want to watch post-vaccination, that will determine, as we were talking about before this session started, when we think vaccines will occur. I'm optimistic. I think that adolescents will have an opportunity to be vaccinated this summer. And I think next fall and winter will be when younger children have an opportunity to be vaccinated. Next slide. So public health recommendations for people who are fully vaccinated. What we all want to know. What can we do? Where can we go? Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So what's important here? We can visit other fully vaccinated people indoors without masks or social distancing. So I started off talking about my in-laws. We were able to go down last week and for the first time in a year, have Sunday brunch together at the table without masks, without social distancing. You can visit with other unvaccinated people from a single household if those unvaccinated people are low risk. So that means if your grandma and grandpa and you're vaccinated and your daughter and son-in-law and your grandchild want to come and they've not yet been vaccinated and none of them are high risk, we say that is a reasonable expectation. But we want to refrain. And so the other thing is if you if you've already been vaccinated, you don't have to be quarantined or have a test if you've been exposed to somebody who has COVID and you have no symptoms, because that vaccine is going to protect you. Next slide. So these are just a list of a number of other things we can do, and I'm going to kind of go through them. So visiting a home, we talked about without a mask, with other fully vaccinated people of any age, without a mask with one household of unvaccinated people who are not at high risk. Traveling, so traveling domestically without a pre or post travel test. So I want to get in the plane and go down to Atlanta to go to the CDC, which I haven't done in months because we've all been working from home. I can now do that since I'm fully vaccinated and I don't need to be tested before or after testing. I don't need to be quarantined after travel. If I decide to travel internationally, it depends upon where I'm going, whether there will be a pre-travel test required. So it's important that you go to the CDC travel website if you're planning on traveling out of the country to understand what the specific requirements are. And that is the same thing about quarantine after travel. Visiting indoors without a mask with people at increased risk for severe illness, we say no. So if I want to go visit my 80-year-old aunt who has not yet gotten her vaccine, it would not be right for me to go without a mask. And then we still don't encourage people to go to medium or large gatherings without careful social distancing and masking. Next slide. So this is where I think it always gets a little complex. So again, the really important thing here to think about is underlying risk for severe COVID among unvaccinated people and members of their households, and the number of households with unvaccinated persons. So if it's a single household and very low risk, then you don't need preventive measures. But if there's from a single household and there's anybody who you think in any way might have high risk, then you all want to wear masks. Or if it's unvaccinated people from multiple households, because then you can't really understand the various risks involved. I also encourage people, because we're working our way into the spring, it's much safer to have any of these events outdoors because you have good ventilation than it is inside. So outdoor picnics and barbecues or a cup of coffee is always going to be safer than anything else. So next slide. So for now, as we said, you should continue to take precautions in public, like wearing a well-fitting mask and physical distancing, avoiding those medium and large size gathering, making sure even if you've been vaccinated, if you get actual symptoms, please get tested. You want to make sure if you're working that your individual employers are offering guidance about how they want you to come to work and when. And then obviously the travel requirements and recommendations, which will continue to evolve as more people in our country are vaccinated and as more people around the world are vaccinated. Next slide. And here's domestic travel. As you can see, this kind of is one more way to say what we just said in terms of, you need to be tested before you travel and after you travel, and you need to put yourself in quarantine for 7 days if you're not vaccinated, and monitor yourself for symptoms and wear a mask. But if you're fully vaccinated, we ask you to just monitor yourself for symptoms and wear a mask. Next slide. And then here's international travel. As you can tell, you need to get tested. There's a test required before you can fly back into the United States. So the CDC has made it public health law that you have to have a test before you can arrive in the CDC. You need to get tested again, and you need to be able to be self-quarantined and monitor yourself for symptoms. If you're fully vaccinated, we still insist that you get a mandatory test before you come into the United States and get tested after your travel, but you do not have to quarantine for a week. Next slide. So this is sort of the science as we see it so far. And as we know, the CDC is completely based on data and science and tries to be the very best it can be data informed and data driven. So we know that fully vaccinated people are at low risk for symptomatic and severe COVID. And we've now had people who are 7, 8, 9 months post-vaccine who were in the clinical trials. We have a number of healthcare workers who were vaccinated in December. So we have a lot of data coming forward. They're less likely to have asymptomatic infection and potentially less likely to transmit SARS-CoV-2 to others. And every month we see that concern that there might have been asymptomatic spread is not happening. There's a very large multi-center test where every college students who have been vaccinated are being tested every week voluntarily to identify is there spread, and we've not yet seen that. The vaccines will likely be affected against emerging variants, but we continue to monitor that very closely. And Congress has given significant funding for the CDC to be able to expand the public health labs around the country, working with states to make sure that we're able to monitor those emerging variants. And if you want to learn more about this, there's a science brief that we can give you the link to. Next slide. And here's some web links for a lot of the information that we shared, and we can share this with you in the chat too. And then lastly, where you can get more information, the next slide, is really there. We have under COVID-19, if you just Google CDC COVID-19, you can get all the information you need. But I also encourage you to look at the COVID, it's the CDC COVID data tracker, and you can see information about all of the vaccines that infections, testing, everything you want to know is all there and very important for you to be able to read and see. So we're going to go back. I think we had a couple of slides about the mRNA vaccine. There was one that I don't know if it's here and we missed it, and maybe what I'll do is just read it to you all and see what questions you might have about the mRNA vaccine. So they carry genetic material that teaches our cells how to make a harmless piece of spike protein. So that mRNA goes in and talks to the DNA and your cell and says, make this harmless piece of spike protein. And once that's made, that's on the surface, that's what you see in all those pictures of the COVID virus, that is destroyed by our cells once copies are made. So the mRNA goes away, it's destroyed. The copies of the spike protein are made, and then your body makes antibodies to that spike protein. So it's just a really incredibly elegant way to make that antibody to that spike protein, which then prevents you from getting COVID. So with that, I am going to stop. I know I covered a lot in a short period of time, and want to see if anybody, I saw a bunch of things in the chat box, so we will work on that. Yeah,
I've been compiling them, Karen. Yes, and thank you for giving us the additional information on the mRNA. Okay, so the first question was, someone is wondering if there are any upcoming plans to study the vaccine's effect on menstrual cycles. This individual has collected an enormous amount of anecdotal evidence on this from their friend community, that there are impacts on the menstrual cycle from the vaccines.
I don't know of anything that's actively being done right now, but I certainly will bring that back. There's an entire team that is looking at both a pregnancy registry and also looking, there was a lot of misinformation that the vaccine could cause problems with fertility, which there was no evidence of that, and there's no reason through science to think that. But I will be glad to bring that back. I mean, I'm not an OBGYN, but what I would tell you is menstrual cycles can be affected by stress, by a number of other things, by something as simple as a strep throat can affect a menstrual cycle. So I'll take that question back, and if we hear of anybody, and Wendy, I'll ask you to write that down, because we'll bring it back to the team that's looking at this. If they know of anybody who's doing that work, if we can get the name of the person who asked, we can connect them up.
Okay, thank you. All right, another question about the vaccine. We have these neighborhood circles that meet also on Zoom, and last night we were talking about vaccines, like I'm sure everybody is. And someone mentioned that people who are immunocompromised, like from rheumatoid arthritis or various other reasons, that they may not develop the COVID antibodies. And I actually found an article in the Atlantic magazine about that today. So for these people, or maybe for all of us, should we be having periodic antibody tests to make sure that we still have antibodies?
Well, that is what so that's what the studies are doing. They're looking at whether you get infected and also what your antibody level is after you've been vaccinated. And they're looking at different age groups. So we can make sure we know, are we still making antibodies at each age group? But in addition, yes, there are many studies being done. And I would tell you, in the oncology community and rheumatology, places where people are immune compromised, they're being very careful to see if people do develop an immune response, to make sure they can help inform that individual, because depending upon what medications there are and how immune compromised they are, they may have a very good response or they may have none. And if you've learned that you haven't made any antibodies, then you want to talk to your doctor and make sure you're still being incredibly careful. And that is one of the reasons why herd immunity is so important, because if you get 100 people in a room, there may be who get vaccinated, there may be 3 or 4 who have severe immune compromise or something else. We want to make sure everybody else in the room is protecting them so that they're not exposed to other people with the infection.
Right. Okay, good. So another question about impacts of the shot. Someone got their first Pfizer shot and it gave them tinnitus. Do you know anything about this? They've submitted it to the, I don't know how to pronounce this, VAERS, the VAERS system.
Yeah, that's the vaccine adverse event reporting system.
Right,
and
you mentioned that earlier.
Exactly what they should do.
Okay.
Because what happens is they look and say, gosh, if we get, a certain amount of people who say they have tinnitus, is it something that happened coincidentally after the vaccine? Or is it coincidental, or is it caused by the vaccine? And so they look at how many reports they get, how often that happens in the population anyhow, and try to see if that's what we call a safety signal.
Mhm.
So I'm very glad, and whoever that is, thank you very much for sending it to VAERS, because that's the only way we can determine those questions and those
Oh,
answers.
okay. Okay. So that's
So
a good
they did
message
a
to
good
all of
public
us.
health, yeah, they did a good public health thing.
All right. Okay. So now a couple things about life after vaccination.
Mhm.
Will the travel recommendations for fully vaccinated people that you showed on the slide, let's see, will they change if the infection numbers keep surging? This individual's is trying to plan their first visit to out-of-state family in over a year, and both households are vaccinated, and they're just sort of wondering, should we do it now or should we wait? Or
If they're all vaccinated, they're safe to travel on a plane, and they're going from one safe house to another safe house. I'm going to see my grandson on Thursday night.
okay.
That gives you an idea, because I'm following CDC recommendations, which I can travel domestically. I would tell you that the CDC and Dr. Walensky will say, even though we say you can do that, it's not a good idea to travel a lot right now because there is a lot more disease. I think it's a decision you all have to make individually, and you have to say, am I going to wear my mask, socially distance, be careful in how I travel, right? And then I'm really going to stay with that protected family when I get there. Then the risk is very low. But if you're going to go out to dinner and take off your masks in restaurants, because remember, any of us who've been vaccinated could be that incredibly small percentage that doesn't get the really big antibody response.
Mhm.
And I do encourage any of you that think you may be immune compromised to talk to your doctor about it, to make sure that you know whether they are thinking you will be fully immunized or not. I do think travel will change. I don't know that we know yet how it will change, because it's, we're still in a race against getting as many people vaccinated as we can versus making sure that the vaccine's effective against variants, and that communities get enough people vaccinated that we can really stop the spread of the disease. I think just based on the people's faces that I saw right before we started, I was saying to somebody earlier today, I have one of my very first distinct memories was going in line with my 4 sisters to get the polio sugar cube vaccine. And I remember both of my parents crying because they were so happy that we were going to be protected, because when they were growing up, they had kids that were affected by polio. I think the generations, people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, who have seen what vaccines did for our country, is really important to have those conversations with people who are younger than you, because they may never have experienced polio or measles outbreaks, or mumps and chickenpox and diphtheria and all the things that we've been able to prevent. So having that conversation about how vaccines are an incredibly important part of our life, I think is a role that many of you can play a leadership role in. Sorry, I just think it's so critically important.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. All right. So I guess the bottom line on the variants is it's nothing to worry about right now. Stay tuned, but it's probably not going to be an issue for this individual who wants to go visit their vaccinated family.
Right.
Okay.
Right. I think I would I'd weigh all I don't know if I'd go to Michigan right now.
Yeah.
It's very,
Right,
very,
it's so high. Yeah.
you just have to think, if everywhere I walk, there's going to be a lot of people who are infected, right? No matter where I go, because there's a lot of disease in the community. So I think it's always a conversation to have about what makes most sense. But the CDC recommendations are to minimize travel, but that it is safe. So if you're traveling by car, where you're not going to be exposed to a lot of people, it's just being thoughtful and thinking about how you're going to do that. I think it's really important. The other part of that question, I would say, is I am cautiously optimistic that we will have enough people vaccinated before there's a variant that doesn't, that the vaccine won't work on. Right now, Pfizer and Moderna are developing boosters, so that if we do have variants, that we'll be prepared to then be able to revaccinate. But it's important for everybody to know on this call that the coronavirus causes, versions of the common cold, but also caused the Mediterranean MERS, and it also caused the first SARS. So it can mutate down to a common cold, and it can mutate up to an even more virulent infection than what we have. And that is why Congress gave billions of dollars to the CDC and to state labs to really monitor it very closely and understand what's happening. Because, you know, it's a novel virus that will do new and different things.
Right. Okay, that's super helpful. Okay, another question, what conditions have to exist before there will be no restrictions on large gatherings like a baseball game? This is the home of the Braves.
I would not hazard to answer that question. But what I would say the conditions would need to exist is that the CDC would be able to show through data that there's not a significant risk to people in a large setting to be infected. So I think it'll be a combination of how many people at that game are vaccinated, what's the amount of disease in the community. I mean, you all probably read and heard about the measles outbreak that occurred through Disneyland a few years ago.
Yeah.
Why was that such a big outbreak? Because there were not as many people kids immunized in California for measles as had been, or, why didn't it happen 5 years earlier? More kids have been immunized. A lot of parents started not immunizing their kids. So there were a lot of kids who were there who were susceptible. So if you're going to that baseball game, it's really a question of how many people are susceptible, which is really the opposite of how many people have been vaccinated, and then how much burden of disease in their community. So how likely are they to be exposed to the virus? And when those numbers make sense and we're able to watch it for a period of time, an abundance of caution, then I think you'll CDC make recommendations for those types of activities. You'll see that we start off with small groups, right? Your family, my family, we're all vaccinated. And over time, we'll get more data about what else works, right? We're learning a lot about nursing homes. If everybody's vaccinated in the nursing homes and the staff is all vaccinated, how many people is that and what does that look like? And so we're constantly collecting data of all those different situations so we can have a better feeling. I'm very optimistic. And I think, our president said he's optimistic that 4th of July, we're going to be able to have barbecues together. I don't think he said we were going to get to go to a baseball game yet, but I think being able to be a barbecue outdoors would be wonderful. The good thing about baseball games is they're outside. So good ventilation again.
That's true. Yeah. So it's really always statistics and risk analysis, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. We have another one now. This is about the mRNA. If a new mRNA vaccine is developed with the same encapsulation, et cetera, so it's a new vaccine, but the same method of getting it in, would new trials to establish safety be required or only trials for efficacy?
They would do safety again, and because unless it was an exact, total copy, which wouldn't happen. So there's enough difference in the lipid protein, the lipid shell that goes around the mRNA from the Pfizer and the Moderna that they're a little bit different. That's why one's 21 days and one's 28 days. So, those are subtle differences, but I think especially because these are emergency use authorizations, they would require, and I'm not an FDA expert, but my expectation would be that they would be required to go through the process. And there are, along with AstraZeneca, and the last vaccine I showed you that is going through, I think there are 2 more companies, one that stopped their work because they were unsuccessful in creating a vaccine, but there are 2 more companies that continue to still work on this.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Now there's a question, with the Moderna vaccine. If you miss the date for your second dose for whatever reason, how long can you go before it's no longer effective?
You should get in and get your second dose as soon as you can. If you've missed it, the sooner you get it, the better, because we know, that length of time, 28 days, and people say, week one way or the other. You don't want to wait 4 months, because the whole idea is you primed your immune system with the first dose, and then that second dose kind of, adds on top of that. So we try and tell people just get in, get your second vaccine. If it's at day 36 instead of day 28, you should be fine. But you don't want to wait 4 months, before you go back in again. We don't have the data to know yet what that looks like, but we do know that if you get it in that window, that you're going to be fine. So that's what we really try hard to encourage people to do.
Mhm. Okay, okay. Carol Galante, if you put that one back in, I just see part of it. Part of your question, so if you'll re-enter that. Okay, another question. So with these new types of vaccines, the mRNA and the other type, if we have another pandemic, assuming it's not COVID, it's something different, something worse, can we assume that with the technology now available, we will have a vaccination within a year? I mean, you know, all other things being equal.
So I never assume anything because science, you know, whatever, I mean, you know, who would have dreamt of Ebola or, you know, or this, right? So I think I would say if we can identify what the pathogen is, then yes, there's a good chance. I think what people don't celebrate enough, I call this our generation's moonshot, in that, you know, the fact that the world of scientists came together at the beginning of this pandemic, in a world where scientists closely guard everything and they wait until they can publish and, you know, they get it out there, and the pharmaceutical companies all want to get their patent. Everybody collectively across the world worked on this together. And while the scientists were studying the technology to make that mRNA vaccine and then to start the clinical trials, the manufacturers were building up their factories to be able to get vaccine out. And all of that happened at the same time, which is historic and pretty amazing. My hope will be, it's a long answer to your question, my hope will be that we will not forget that. And we will, as a country, try and make sure that we always have that resource available. And I think one of the hard things, having been in public health for a long time, you know, after 9/11, everybody assumed that the worst thing that could happen would be bioterrorism. Then it was, you know, bird flu, right? And then we had H1N1, which was sort of a precursor to this. Now we've got COVID. So I don't know what the next big public health crisis will be, but the better we can strengthen our system of public health to be able to respond, but then also the researchers to be able to have the ability to do the kind of research they did this year is going to be huge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, thank you. And another one, just did you say that a vaccine for children will possibly be available by this fall? Is that what you thought?
That's a very optimistic. I would tell you that most people say the winter, your fall,
Okay.
my winter. You know, I mean, I do
Yeah.
think it is on the horizon.
Okay.
And unless there are safety signals in younger children that we haven't seen anywhere else, then you know, I fully anticipate that will be happening sometime this year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So someone heard that Canada is having their 2 vaccines spread several months apart. Is that because they don't have enough of the product on hand? And someone else said they heard the same in England. I think in England, they're just getting a single vaccine.
Well, yeah, there are 2 different philosophies there. England decided that they would rather, so once you've gotten your Moderna vaccine, you're about 80% protected. So it gives you enough, you know, that on average, people are about 80% protected from severe disease, hospitalization, death. When you get your next one, you get up to 90, 95. So what England decided philosophically was, we want to vaccinate more people more quickly. We'll give everybody a first shot. Then we'll go back and start giving those second shots, knowing that they didn't have the data yet to know whether there would be a problem in giving the second shot. Canada made the same choice. The United States said, we are very worried that especially the elderly and people in nursing homes are having horrible outcomes. We want to save those lives because it was about saving lives first. So they said, we're going to make sure they all get their first dose and second dose, then healthcare workers. So our system has been, we're adding more groups. People are, you know, somebody's getting their first and second dose, you know, in kind of this cycle that continues to go along.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
Hildegard, I think you could be Oprah.
So let's see. Could you talk a little bit? This is close to all our hearts. And finally, someone asked the question. Could you talk a little bit about criteria we should consider as we begin to think about opening up segments of our congregational life at UUCA?
Well, I think that's where you start to think about, if you want to follow the CDC guidance, right? Everybody who's vaccinated, small group, you're all sure you're vaccinated, come together and, that becomes, kind of your little pod, right? And then as the CDC gets more information, they'll say you can make that a bigger group, and I'm sure you've all struggled with how do we sit around a room far enough apart and socially distanced with masks on. But I think, again, what the CDC recommendations say is small groups, everybody vaccinated, outdoors. You have people come together outdoors and they're fully vaccinated and people keep their distance. That's a safe thing to be able to do. So, and I encourage you to look at and Wendy can give you, Reverend, the information sort of about how to do this safely. And a lot of it is, I think one of the biggest things is outside and people kind of, sitting, you bring your lawn chairs and sit a little bit farther apart. Everybody's vaccinated, then you can feel good that everybody's vaccinated, but also that if that person we talked about who might be immunocompromised or might have just gotten their first vaccine and don't have their antibodies up, you're taking care of them too, and Wendy just sent the consideration for communities of faith.
Mhm.
So that really kind of walks through a lot of things. We do know that singing is something that aerosolizes a lot of all of our air from our lungs. And so that can be particularly risky, is to be in an environment where people are singing.
Mhm.
Okay, so it sounds like a tent meeting. A Unitarian Universalist tent meeting is in our future.
Well, I've been wanting to do revivals even before the pandemic. So
Here you go, Karen.
You just can't have big singing while you're doing it,
That's true. That's true. We just have to hum.
Or
Okay.
do AS, or do sign
Karen.
language.
Yeah. There you go.
Karen, could I try out something on you? It seems to me one of the things I've heard people ask that I just want you to affirm that maybe I've got the right idea about this. But one of the things that saves so much time with the mRNA vaccine was that within weeks of the isolation of the virus, the genetic blueprint of that virus was published for everybody to get to.
Exactly.
So any company that was interested in making a vaccine could immediately use that to make it. And then once you had that, the amount of time it took was sort of the regular amount in terms of developing the vaccine, getting it ready to send out and all that was in parallel to that was really good. But for years, the old vaccines, to get to the place that you could even begin a clinical trial would take years and years and years. Just like the polio vaccine, it took forever to get that worked out. People knew about it in the 30s, but it took forever to be able to have a vaccine that was safe. So that's the part that got truncated. And for anybody who thinks that the going it fast cut any corners, there were no corners cut after you had a vaccine that you could test. And what happened was to get a vaccine you could test came much, much sooner. And to me,
Well, and
that's sort of the moonshot, because we ought to be able to do that the next part, or at least we have the possibility to try that rather quickly with the next epidemic.
yeah, well, and I think it speaks volumes to the work of the World Health Organization, to the work of health leaders across, not just in our country, but across multiple different countries, to be able to have that level of commitment to share that information. And then, I mean, that was the beginning, right? So now that we know the genetic sequencing and we've got it, people shared research as they were doing it real time, which has never had, you wait until it's published. And so that was huge. And I think, again, I can't speak enough about how important that was. And then the investment, and it was a, bipartisan investment in making sure that if we got the vaccine, the right makeup, that we had the factories that could make it, and we had the people ready to do those clinical trials. And then the other heroes that nobody talks about are all the people who were in the clinical trials, who raised their hand and said, I will do this. That's like, it was a very brave thing to do, and they did it for all of us. So any of you who are in a clinical trial, I say a huge thank you to you, because it was very important.
Yeah. Okay. How long after someone recovers from COVID or tests positive, if they happen to be asymptomatic, should they get vaccinated? So what's the period between?
We were recommending up to 90 days to wait, but that was also because of the idea that you would be protected for at least 90 days. So you could let other people get in line first. And I actually would have to go back and see, and Wendy, you're probably on the website right now, if you can see if they've changed that. Because I think there's less of a, less of the stretch out was more the idea that if you've just been infected, you're not going to get reinfected right now. So we'll pause you getting vaccinated so somebody else can get in line first. But now that we have plenty of vaccine, I'm not sure if that recommendation's been changed. And so I'm going to see if Wendy hopefully can look it up for us while we're talking.
Okay.
I'm pulling up and I'm going to put two in because I think there's two different elements there. One is that if you had the monoclonal antibodies, there is still the 90-day waiting period.
Okay.
If otherwise, the guidance is more you should wait until you are no longer infectious and need to be isolated to prevent spread of others, because you don't want to get your nurse COVID while you get your COVID shot.
So does
Okay.
that make sense to everybody? The monoclonal antibodies and the convalescent plasma are two different therapies that have been studied and are continuing to be studied by the NIH and others. And the antibodies are antibodies, artificial antibodies that are made to COVID, with the idea being that we're giving you those antibodies that will help you fight that infection. The convalescent plasma is from somebody who's been infected, and you're essentially getting their antibodies. They're still in the process to see, we think with the monoclonal antibodies, some recent studies are looking like maybe it can shorten the time in the hospital, so prevent some hospitalizations and the severity of illness. The convalescent plasma, again, this is not under the CDC's purview, it's under NIH, but they're continuing to do those studies. But because you would already have a lot of antibodies in your body, the concern is that you would not respond to the vaccine. Where if you've had a normal infection, you have just normal amounts of antibodies. And so getting your vaccine, as Wendy said, once you're no longer symptomatic, so you don't get anybody else infected, and you feel good enough to go back in.
Okay. Okay, that's helpful.
Karen, may I run one other thing by you? I
Sure.
think time, and that is, you said it, but it was so short. I'm not sure everybody got it. And that is that there was a lot known about the biology of COVID, the virus COVID, that they knew from other studies of the other diseases that COVID caused, including the cold, that it was a spike protein that was the way it got into the cell. And so they knew which protein to code the mRNA for, so your body would make antibodies to it. You might get a virus where you didn't know much about, how it works, and you might have to discover all that, which would slow it up. But with this vaccine, with this virus, we're a little bit lucky that way. And another way that no important corners were cut, it was just that we had done a lot of science before that prepared us to be able to make it go faster.
Mhm.
Well, and because we had the first SARS outbreak, as you all remember, that was in China and Taiwan and in Canada, and then the MERS outbreak that happened in the Middle East and a few cases in the US, we were kind of forewarned.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Godfrey. That's helpful too. Okay. Next question. The effectiveness of the vaccines from China and Russia are unknown. What concerns does this raise for worldwide herd immunity?
Well, I think it's going to be a long time before we have worldwide herd immunity. Think about how many countries don't even have access to vaccine yet. And yeah, the Russians and the Chinese have not shared their data on their vaccine effectiveness yet. But again, I'm optimistic, but I'm always optimistic that through the World Health Organization, and as we all, work as a world to try and quit pointing fingers at who's got more disease and who doesn't, and how do we really combat this? Because it is a significant impact on the economy of the world. People who are in countries that are low income and middle income have been much worse hit than countries like our own. And it'll be harder for them to get everyone vaccinated. So I think those are questions that are really important questions, and they'll be really important questions as we start to think about how do philanthropy and countries invest in vaccines to help vaccinate the rest of the world. How do we be good civic partners? We still at the CDC, every week I get the report on where's polio, in the rest of the world, and the work to eradicate polio. And I go back to, when did we really have the big push for polio vaccine in our country? And we still have polio, 50 years later. So COVID will not go away. but it will hopefully be manageable, and hopefully we as a nation and we as the world will plan together to figure out how we can do all we can to minimize the impact on every country.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think I got all the questions. This has been fabulous. So appreciate your taking the time to spend with us tonight, and your willingness to answer these disparate kinds of questions that we've come up with. So this has just been really great. Thank you so much, Karen. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
And I have to say, I'm not a vaccinologist, and I'm not even really a research scientist, as you heard. But being a pediatrician, vaccines have been front and center in my career the whole way along. And in some ways, I hope all of you realize that I would leave you thinking about, if you've got a friend. I actually this afternoon had a cup of coffee with my daughter's babysitter from, they're in their 30s now, and she happened to be in the neighborhood. We had coffee together, and she hasn't gotten vaccinated. So we spent 15 minutes kind of talking about it and what could we do and how important it was, and how important it was to my family that she be around to celebrate grandchildren and that we do it together. And it's those kinds of conversations. I mean, I think these tonight, to learn the science, to know the facts are important, but now you know where you can go look them up again in case you forget them. Or if you don't have Wendy to have your back every day. But I think what you all bring is a wisdom and an experience with vaccines to help share that information with people in your neighborhood, people you love. And then the other thing I'd highly recommend everybody think about is, do you know somebody who's homebound? And maybe they're homebound because they're ill, but maybe they're homebound because they can't drive anymore. Or somebody who has a disability, to reach out and say, hey, can I drive you to get vaccinated? Can I help you get that done? Because we all have friends, family, neighbors who are in that situation. Any way we can help them, this is the time, right, for all of us to be compassionate and caring.
Right.
So I would say thank you to all of you. And Hildegard, I think you could either be on NPR or Oprah. You had those questions down.
Okay. And thank you also to Cindy. That was great. We appreciate your help, Cindy, as our tech.
Yes,
team.
Cindy, thank you. You were fantastic. Good
Yeah.
team.
And
Karen,
Wendy.
I don't know if your son's still there, but he was like the cutest ever.
She had to leave probably to put him to bed.
You're probably right.
Yeah. So before all of you leave, I do want to mention that next week we are starting a 3-part series that Adult RE is co-sponsoring with the Climate Action Team at UUCA. And the 3 classes will touch on issues of environmental justice relating to racism and public health, and how people of color and people in poverty are especially affected by climate change. So I think these are going to be some very, very informative sessions. Please come back next Tuesday, and then on the following, which is May 4th, and then again on May 11th. So I hope to see all of you there, and thank you again, a fabulous program. We are so grateful to Godfrey to tell us about you, Karen, and to you for coming.
Well, it was my pleasure and privilege. Thank you so much. And thank you, Godfrey.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Hi. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.